is good, everybody? It's me, Karsten Craning, back again for another YouTube video. And today we're talking about Rick Owens. We're doing some analysis on the man, the myth, the legend himself. Obviously, Rick Owens is extremely popular, but he's also really important to me. He's one of my favorite designers, and I wore him a lot, especially when I was young, first getting into kind of high fashion. But I haven't ever seen a lot of analysis on Rick or his clothes. I've seen a lot of history of his life, his career, and I've seen a lot of like buzzwords be thrown around like grunge, glam, brutalist, shock value, proto-human, etc., etc. But I haven't actually seen a lot of like analysis on what makes his design so special. A lot of people just call Rick Owens' design philosophy like goth, or they just call it Rick Owens, like style of making clothes. And I don't think that really gets into what makes him so special and why for the past 20 years he's been really consistent and always putting out great collections. So I want to understand Rick Owens beyond the buzzwords today and really get into him. So we're going to get into that. Okay, first of all, usually with designer background, it's just talking about how they grew up isn't really important. It sometimes brings in a little bit extra, but not like a lot. But with Rick Owens, it's really integral to understand his childhood and upbringing because it really plays a lot into his designs. Rick Owens' work is heavily steeped in his upbringing, and much of it is a response to his relationship with his father. Now, Rick Owens grew up in Fresno, California. His father was a social worker and his mother was a seamstress. Rick was homeschooled by his father. His father was sort of a traditionalist, conservative, who didn't really believe that public education was sufficient. To Rick Owens' father credit, he also was an intellectual in many senses. Rick learned a lot about not only classical philosophy, art, music, architecture, literature, all from his father and his extensive private library. And this education really made Rick well-versed in the arts and in an academic sense. For example, most people who go through a typical American public education don't know of any different periods of art in Japan, or really about the art in Japan besides kind of what it looks like. But Rick is really well-versed in that, and that's just because the American public education system isn't that good. They don't really get in depth with the arts or philosophy. And Rick Owens did learn in depth about art and other subjects, and that's one of the reasons he is such a great designer. He has a lot more references to be inspired by than someone who doesn't have this education. While Rick did receive an amazing kind of classical education from his father, it also wasn't the best relationship for him. His father was, as he described, an intellectual bully who was extremely traditionalist. For example, his father wouldn't let him listen to anything but classical music in the house, and that kind of made Rick kind of rebellious because of these things. He got into punk rock at the time, growing up in the 80s California, got into the hardcore scene, became inspired by Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, the Stooges, for example. And this kind of counterculture really it got ingrained into his identity in his teenage years. So not only does Rick have this really well sense of the classical arts, he's very well versed in that, but he's also a big proponent of this sort of countercultural art, for example, like punk rock, and that's also going to play a part. Both of these kind of cultural ideas are swirling in his head and will play a big part in his career later. From Rick Owens' upbringing, two really important things happen. First, he gains this knowledge of the art, which just gives him an edge over a lot of designers. Second big thing is that a lot of his work in the future is going to become very reactionary to his father's values. Rick Owens is very provocative. You've probably seen all the ads and kind of controversial things. And the reason he does this is to kind of engage in what he would call intellectual sparring with his father and his father's values. He would often describe his father as an intellectual bully, so to kind of come at him with his own art is kind of what he's doing. If you're ever wondering why Rick's clothes and advertisements and just kind of general world is controversial, provocative, or just generally weird, that's why. It's in this response to his father's traditional values. Rick eventually decided to become a fashion designer and moved to Los Angeles, and he gets a job making knockoff garments. The thing about making knockoff garments, however, is that it's a really great way to learn how to structure a garment. You're pretty much taking all of these high fashion, really good designers, taking it apart and remaking it for yourself. And while it isn't the traditional education you get as someone who goes into fashion design, it was a really good supplement for him and really helped his own design abilities. Eventually, after copying these clothes and working in this design warehouse for some time, he created his own brand, it got started, and the rest is really history. Now, getting into the question, why is Rick Owens so special? There's a lot of words that can be used to describe Rick Owens. For example, it's futuristic, but it's also kind of ancient. It's occult in some senses, but other times it's rather biblical. It's grunge, it's glam, it's gothic, it's punk rock, it's post-apocalyptic, it's classical in some senses, while also being rather warrior-esque. But the problem with all of these kind of words that are often thrown around when you talk about Rick Owens is you can't apply them to every collection. Well, these are definitely motifs with a lot of his collections. They're not every single collection. You can't call every Rick Owens collection gothic because some of his collections aren't all black. And you can't call other Rick Owens collections ancient because sometimes they're futuristic and vice versa. These are all definitely themes to Rick Owens, maybe punk rock, gothic, ancient, futuristic, but they're not at the core of Rick's design identity. I think the artistic lens that Rick Owens has at the core of his design principles is actually architecture, or the design spirit of that. What I mean by artistic lens is that the lens is the main design motif that all other motifs fall under. So all the words we just said, glam, grunge, etc., are all used and organized and united by his design lens, or the spirit of maybe some sort of architectural design. For other designers, their lens are going to be different. For example, I think maybe something like Jun Takahashi saying his central lens would probably be punk. And for Yohji Yamamoto, his kind of central lens, or the way he builds his artistic framework, is around the art of draping. But for Rick Owens, architecture actually makes a lot of sense. Besides his clothes, it's what he's known for: architecture, interior design. A lot of people own and buy Rick Owens furniture. His interiors and houses that he's designed are extremely obsessed over as well. Rick Owens at his core is really educated and knows a lot about architecture and interior design, and that plays a profound role in his thinking and his creative style. For example, it's really well known that Rick is extremely thoughtful about his show venues. The places he chooses, he loves the architecture, but he also thinks about how that architecture reflects his collection. For example, he's chosen more brutalist architecture for shows that are more stark and kind of darker, but then he's chosen maybe more classical architecture for times where the mood's a little bit lighter with the collection. But this kind of goes beyond a second hobby or careful curation for a show, but into the design of the garments itself. There's a lot of influences all the way from brutalist to ancient architecture in the design of his garments and with the way he structures his garments. Yohji focuses on how the garments will drape, Dries focuses on the fabric and the pattern, and Rick focuses on creating a garment in the same way you would create the structure of a building or a piece of furniture. When you look at a Rick Owens collection, you can see how he's taking design cues from architecture in the way that the garments are structured. It's always present, but it's also what differentiates him from a lot of designers in a way. Not a lot of designers take cues from architecture in the sense that the object is formed in such a structured way. Instead, it's often about the flow of the fabric, and the movement with the body is emphasized. For Rick, it's really about creating the structured object rather than something that flows with the body as much as it does with other designers. While this is the core, there are a lot of different themes and motifs that Rick also works with, and that's what makes his work so rich to explore. In one collection, it might be the core is some sort of architectural structure, but you might also have references to Lou Reed, Jean-Paul Sartre, and also ancient Minoan societies all in one collection. There's a lot of different architectural design that you see Rick Owens reference. A lot of the popular ones though are like using ancient type of designs, brutalist, Bauhaus, and then also some classical architecture are kind of the main ones that he kind of takes from. You can also really see that in his furniture as well. I mentioned that he makes furniture, but his furniture is very much inspired by those styles of architecture. What makes Rick Owens is his architectural design spirit that he brings into the world of clothes. But I think with Rick Owens, a lot more people are attracted to him just beyond the design of his clothes. There really is a cult following around Rick Owens, and it goes beyond his clothes into who Rick is as a person. I mean, there's tons of Rick cult members wearing his clothes and making TikTok edits of Rick just eating pizza and talking. In part, I think it's definitely because of Rick's iconic designs and the way he makes clothes, but I also think it's because Rick Owens as a person is a very rare type of person. In his interviews, Rick Owens goes against every stereotype that you would think of as a fashion designer. He's well-spoken, well-read, kind, and humble. While most fashion designers are kind of seen as shallow, hedonistic, obsessed with glamour, that's just not the way Rick comes off. And Rick Owens isn't just a rare type of person in fashion, but really in all of media or with all of public figures in general. I think if you look at the way how men are portrayed in the media, there just really aren't a lot of cool dudes who are also smart, well-spoken, and disciplined. He's definitely in that rare category of man with maybe Anthony Bourdain, Henry Rollins, or Indiana Jones. You know, the type where there's some sort of sense of ruggedness, punk rock, or rebellion, or something along the lines of that, but also a sense of true wisdom, intelligence, and moral grounding. Rick is not only super smart, but he makes cool shit and works out. He has the physique of a warrior and kind of dresses like a futuristic space soldier type thing, which is super cool. But he's also well educated and has some sort of moral grounding that most people don't seem to put on the forefront of who they are as a person. Most designers aren't going to be as humble as him or have quotes like, "I think the sexiest thing a woman can wear is kindness." At this point, it seems like I just have a massive man crush on the dude. But it's easy to see why people become enthralled with him when our society really doesn't have a lot of examples of people like this. In our society, as a man or just as a person in general, the bar is set really low of you. You don't have a lot of expectations, and because of that, we have a lot of shitty people. And there are people like Rick Owens who set the bar higher of how you should challenge yourself and what kind of person you should be. And that's really good. And I think the reason he's popular is because our society kind of craves those types of people who set the bar higher. Anyway, I think that's why Rick Owens is popular. I think that kind of gets into the spirit of design. My name is Karsten Craning. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, etc. And I will see you guys soon.